Okay, here we go. Today is chapter 16. My eyes flashed open to gloom and grey, punctuated by a disk of white. At first I mistook it to be a mask of bone under a pair of ivory-coloured antlers, surrounded by a black, bristly mane. I startled backwards, taking a sharp breath. But then the disk swam clearly into view. A full, round, silver-dollar moon stared down through the window. I collapsed into my own bed as a sheen of cold sweat covered my skin. Where I'd clutched the psychopomp, my swollen hand throbbed and ached, as if my fingers had been wrenched backwards in their sockets. Emma sat in the chair at my bedside. Her red hair was tangled and uncombed. Her eyes were tumescent from weeping. When she saw me jerk awake, she caught her breath in her throat and threw her arms around me before beginning to cry anew. "Oh, Harry," she gasped. "What's happened?" "Mr. Blackwood brought you home. He said you'd had a fit and fell to the kitchen floor and struck your head," she said, and she lay her right hand upon my neck, and her skin felt warm and dry. "But he's lying, isn't he? I don't sense any hint of a seizure about you. Seizures feel all bubbly and sparkly, but you feel cool and dark like the underside of a stone." She peered into my eyes, seeking clarity. "When he brought you home, you were on the cusp of death. Your spirit was so diminished and hiding deep in your core." "What else did you sense?" I asked. "Confusion," she said, and her eyes grew fearful and wide. "I don't know. I've helped with sprains and broken bones and bruises, but I've never come across this. You're burned? Or, no, not burned." Her voice dropped to a hush. "You're not burned. Sorry, you are burned, but not physically." "An apt description," I said, struggling to sit, holding my palm to my pounding head. "Why did he lie to Mamma and Papa?" she said. "Harry, here, let me help you up. Why would he not tell the truth?" "Because the truth is too strange to digest all in one sitting," I answered. "There is something ancient and malevolent stalking the people of Dunham, Emma, and it is fierce and frightful and wholly without mercy. It's like a disease infecting everyone it touches. We must proceed with caution. It feeds on the minds of those who cross its path, and it hungers for chaos and disarray." She looked stunned. Then in a haste she took up my injured hand. The warmth of her healing touch spread like summer sunlight over my skin. "We must warn the regiment," she said. "I agree," I said, "but we must be careful too. The monster wears the face of someone we know. It could be anyone." "Mr. Marsh will not have been so cursed," she said firmly. "He is worthy of our trust, and he will believe me if I tell him." I nodded. "I like him very much, Emma. He has a good heart." She bent her head to the task of healing, but said with self-depreciation, "I was very jealous when I saw him riding up to the cottage with you, sitting before him on his horse." "I have no designs upon him, I assure you," I replied. "He is not my type." "In the morning, straight away, you and I will go to town," she began, "and we shall head directly to Mr. Marsh, and he will be our support when we tell Captain Crankshaw that—" Her comment died on her lips. Her eyes widened, starting at the window. She shunted back, and I managed to clamp my hand over her mouth to muffle her blood-curdling scream. The moon in the window was gone. In fact, all the view was gone, disappeared behind a shifting curtain of purple tentacles and pale suckers, slurping at the glass. "Don't be afraid," I said to Emma, removing my hand from her mouth. I unlatched the window and let a few of the more persistent tendrils in, and they wrapped around my injured hand with such grace and gallantry that even Emma could see their intent was honorable. "I'm all right," I said. "I'm much improved." Nate was a swirling mix of relief and fear and anger. There was culpability, too, and that particular intimate form of bitter hatred reserved for relations who betray you. "He was only doing what he thought best," I said, but Nate would not accept that. Almost as if he spoke words, I felt his intentions. Thorne does not consider the human cost of his goal, and one must be careful around him, for he can be lost in his ambitions and not weigh the outcome. For Thorne, the end always justified the means. Emma was breathing in small, shallow gulps. "Oh, how rude of me," I said. "Nate, this is my youngest sister." And turning to my sister, I said, "Emma, this is my friend Nate." "Oh," she said very quickly and very quietly, "it has a name." One tentacle snaked forward, wrapped around Emma's hand, and gave it a firm shake. I returned my attention to Nate. "In the morning, Emma and I will inform the regiment. I fear that anyone who looks upon the beast, who has not grown up under the influence of these books, will unravel under the strain. I saw it in Mrs. Rabbit. Her mind was disintegrating. I'd never felt the onslaught of madness before, and I did not recognize the sensations or the signs." There was a question upon his skin. I closed my eyes, concentrating. "I don't understand, Nate," I said. "Slow down. You're all muddled." The tentacles whipped around my arms, my neck, my hands, increasing the contact area of our skin. His complexion flushed from orange to purple, and then to a magical iridescent silver white that almost glowed in the candlelight. I felt suction cups pulling at my cheek and tendrils winding through my hair. The sensations were urgent, compelling, troubled, and over all of these impulses arched an umbrella of dissatisfaction. So I took a stab at translating his heart. If you're worried for me, please, you must set that aside. It will do neither of us any good for you to be distracted by concern. Oh, such frustration. His silver-white skin darkened into mottled red. I cannot understand, I said. Then quite suddenly, he sorted his thoughts into clear focus, and the message pealed clear and loud in my mind. My eyes flashed open. Oh, I'm your only link to the world. I'm the only one who understands you. If I'm lost, you are again trapped in a world without conversation, and you would rather die than spend another day in solitary, wordless hopelessness. I flushed with warmth, and I caressed my fingers over his skin. You can't bear to be without me. Such relief flooded through him, I almost collapsed at the strength of it. I pressed a kiss to one tentacle. Silly octopus, I teased, I won't be lost, nor will you be silenced, and I shall not leave you. We'll find a copy of that wretched copper book and bring you back to your former self, I promise. One particularly large suction cup smacked a huge sloppy kiss on my cheek, so impassioned that I continued to feel the sensation of it after all the tentacles withdrew from the window, and the motion of an invisible body slinking through the garden had stilled. I reclined against the window and watched him go, my heart in my throat. When I glanced back at Emma, she was smiling broadly. He has your affections, she gasped. Did I not assure you? I replied. Mr. Marsh is not my type. Oh, I suppose not, she replied. He hasn't got enough limbs. I gazed out the window once more, in the direction of dark and dreary Northwich Hall. My feelings will not be repressed, I said. How ardently I admire and adore him. He is the most clever, most thoughtful, most handsome gentleman I have ever had the pleasure of meeting, I sighed. Handsome? Not in the least, Emma replied as she dissolved into laughter. But my goodness, he certainly does make an impression. When my sisters and I hurried straight to the camp after our breakfast, we were informed by the bugle boy that Captain Crankshaw had ridden out to Dreadmore with a cohort of men at dawn. They intended to search the cliffs above the canyon for evidence that might explain the circumstances behind the rabbit's death, and if we were so inclined to walk the breadth of the wild heath, we'd find the captain there. It was a long hike in damp conditions, and the harsh wind gnawed at our hands and tugged at our skirts, but we arrived at the boundary between heath and canyon within the hour, having been spurred to a fast pace by the general misery of the weather. Men in red jackets had scattered themselves across the rolling landscape with heads down, looking for any tracks or scraps of clothing, for signs of struggle or splatters of blood. But their drawn faces and stoic concentration, it was clear that the search had thus far been unsuccessful. Mr. Marsh spotted us first, 4 women in pale dresses striding over the blackened land, and he galloped his horse out to greet us. As pleased as I am to see the Lovecraft sisters, this is no place for young ladies, he called out as he drew rein. You must head back to the village. Has there been any news, sir? None, he said to me. I'm afraid there are no clues to follow. The captain has us looking for wolf prints, but the men are restless, and many suspect that we're following a ghost. You're in peril, Richard, Emma said. You won't find the culprit out here, and if you do find him, the mere sight of him will drive you mad, just as it did the poor rabbit family. Mr. Marsh dismounted so that we might speak on equal terms. Are you saying, he said slowly, looking pointedly at Emma, that the mother and father did themselves self-harm? He looked to me. Impossible, it was no suicide. How can you know for sure? I said. They were woven too tightly with brambles, Miss Harriet, he said to me, and he dropped his voice to a rasp. He could no longer hide his fear or confusion. I saw a sheen of perspiration appear on his brow, an involuntary reaction to his superstitious horror only barely contained. The vines had grown straight down their gullets. The thorns had torn their innards to shreds. From the evidence of a struggle and the agony they must have suffered. His throat hitched, and he shook his head, unable to describe further. Jane stepped forward. The circumstances of their death may not have been suicide, but they were driven to lunacy by an outside force, just as the Posey family was cursed so long ago. It's Harry's theory that whomever catches sight of the culprit will find himself rendered useless, and perhaps even dangerous to his companions. Then you certainly must leave, Mr. Marsh insisted. Young women should not roam about the countryside unaided. As he spoke, Jane laid a hand upon his wrist. Instantly he froze. This gets us nowhere, she said to us, as if Mr. Marsh had ceased to be in our party. It's true, It's true, he looked as though he was no longer in attendance. His eyes were dull and stared at a distant point on the horizon. His mouth was parted mid-sentence. Jane kept her hand on his arm and said, "The men will never listen to us. We can beg and plead all day long, and the captain will insist that this is the work of a non-existent wolf, and will be no farther ahead in our task." "Oh, please don't do that to him, Jane," Emma pleaded. "Poor man, can he still hear us?" Mary spoke to Jane and me, ignoring our youngest sister's distress. "We must make them listen," said Mary. "If they're really here to protect the village, then we must give them all the tools they need to do their job and fulfill their responsibility." The horse nuzzled up against me, befuddled by the stone-like stillness of its rider. "Jane may be right," I said, and with a certain snide brassiness added, "They'll cast aside our good advice because we lack the proper genitalia to have a worthy opinion." "Harry," Emma scolded. "It's true," Jane agreed. "Can you bewitch them?" Mary asked, but Jane scoffed at the suggestion. "A whole army? I doubt it." She tapped her hand against Mr. Marsh's unflinching arm. "1 man, maybe, but not 100. "Then for their own safety, we must send them on a goose chase and keep them far from the path of our quarry," I continued. "But I dare not send them too far afield, because we'll need them to apprehend our culprit too, once he's been unmasked. Ah, I know. Jane, please restore Mr. Marsh to his former awareness." She looked up to him, removed her hand, and he blinked a few times as if waking. "I forgot what I was saying," he muttered. I stepped forward. "Mr. Marsh, please inform the captain that there have been sightings of a frightful beast around the fairy stones, and it may have constructed a den there. He might even wish for the soldiers to dig up a stone or two, just to make sure there's no tunnels under them. As you no doubt have heard, the badgers of this country can reach an astronomical size, and we may yet find that Earl's disappearance was due to a particularly ornery one." Still befuddled, he accepted my explanation with the ease and pliability of one in a dream. "Of course. Thank you, Miss Lovecraft," he said with a rush of breath. I've never heard of extraordinary badgers in Upper Watley." "Then count your town fortunate. They give us a great deal of trouble here in Dunham." "Huge things," Mary replied, "much bigger than average." He took her comment as truth, for she was a better example than any of us. "I'll go at once," he said, and offered us a pert nod before unsteadily mounting the horse and galloping off, calling out to the captain as he left. Emma folded her arms, looking cross. "'Tis bad enough to bend one's intention, Jane. Now you've started removing a gentleman's free will completely." "A very nifty trick," Mary complimented. Jane looked very pleased with herself, but said, "My apologies, Emma." We watched the soldiers collect themselves into tidy lines, sling their shovels over their shoulders, and march toward the distant rise in the land south of us, where the pillars of the fairy stones jutted upwards to a steel-grey sky. The red jackets looked like bright garnets cast over a dark carpet, or spots of blood against a wiry black hide. We turned towards the east and began rambling back in the direction of the village, and Mary looked down at me. "How can the rabbits have died with brambles growing through their gullets?" she said. "It's just as strange as Earl's death, trapped in a tree." Jane said, "And didn't the old tree have fresh leaves growing upon it? That's what caught Teddy Crumpsell's attention and led him to see Earl's foot." I held my shawl more tightly to my throat. Nature herself is rising up against us. We walked a little farther in silence, and when Emma slipped her hand over the crook of my arm, I felt the brittle sheen of dread on her skin. "Do you think the fact that Teddy found Earl might link them together?" "Perhaps," I replied to her. "But what about George? What connection does he have to Teddy or Earl?" "None that I can see," Mary said as she stomped over a rise in the land and plucked a sprig of heather from the ground. Little purple flowers bloomed between her strong fingers. "The heather blooms very early this year." Jane took the sprig from her. "The brambles, the tree, the heather, amid so much death, new life springs?" But I was unsettled by it rather than comforted. "The world is unbalanced," I said, musing to myself. "Can you feel it? Everything seems crooked somehow, like the Tower of St. Dismas. It's all just tilted enough for us to doubt our senses." I looked back the way we'd come. "Something's not right." "Well, I think it was a good idea, Harry, sending the soldiers to the fairy stones," said Mary. "I don't much like the idea of the men digging them up, but it'll keep the regiment occupied for days." "If only our problem was as simple as an oversized badger," said Emma. We walked on a little further. My hand began to ache. "Sore?" said Emma, when she saw me favoring it. "Yes." "And your ankle?" "As good as new," I replied, "and my hand will be fine in a day or two." "Can I tell Jane and Mary about your friend?" she said, her eyes twinkling. When Jane turned with a puzzled look, Emma said, "He came to visit Harry last night and inquired after her health." "Friend?" said Mary. "Harry has no friends." "It can't be Mr. Blackwood," said Jane as we reached the wider track and turned towards the Darling house in the vale. He was in a tizzy when he brought you home, and knew full well the state of your mind. He thought he'd killed you for sure. We all thought you were... Sorry, wrong person. Wrong voice. We all thought you were good as dead, said Emma. It's no wonder your friend would venture out to see you. He must have been worried sick. Mary nodded. And when the life started to come back to you, you ranted about all manner of things, like a child with a high fever. I stopped. Like what? Mary and Jane looked to each other. I don't remember, said Jane. I think teeth? Yes, you were frightened of teeth. And the East Bridge, said Mary. You muttered about the waters under the East Bridge. Did I mention the fairy stones? I don't know, said Emma. Why? Why indeed? I'd given it no thought. The suggestion to Mr. Marsh had sprung as easily to my lips as if the stones had been forefront in my mind. You look stricken, Harry, said Jane. What's wrong? My gut clenched. I'd suggested they visit the fairy stones in a fit of inspiration, but the place had come to my lips because it had been brought there through the song of the psychopomp. I'd seen Mrs. Rabbit's madness. I'd felt her thoughts fraying. I'd seen the smashed glass of Earl's psyche. I'd seen things I couldn't describe, things I wouldn't describe, but I had also caught a glimpse of the fairy stones. Had I not crossed paths with the monster here on Dreadmore Heath? I've sent them to the mouth of the devil, I gasped. I clutched Mary's hand, felt her confusion and concern. The stones, they were a melody in the song of the psychopomp. Her confusion increased tenfold. Oh, damn it, trust me, I've put them in danger. We turned back upon our path and ran to catch up with the regiment. For every pace I felt my fear increase, and when we crested the highest point in the heathland, I was sure that a horror awaited us. I braced myself for the sight of blood and gore, of agony and writhing terror. But instead, we discovered a scene of clockwork perfection. Captain Crankshaw portioned out the work from horseback, and the men were pulling shovels and axes, preparing to topple the pillars. The grey mizzle had broken, the fog had evaporated, and shafts of golden sunlight pierced the thinning clouds, striking the uneven landscape and warming the soil. There was even a blush of purple on the high ground, where more of the tiny heather flowers had bloomed early under these fine and clement conditions. I hurried straight through the lines of men, pulling up the turf, and crested the embankment until I stood before the captain. Sir, I am mistaken. This is not the place, I replied, stammering in my haste. I'm sorry, I've made an error. The man regarded me with gruff disdain. He looked down his nose and ran one finger thoughtfully over the scar on his chin. I should think this is as good a place to check as any, he said. The earth is dewy, the place quite wild. Go on, Mr. Frame, Mr. Keel, bring down the North Stone, and let us search for tunnels underneath. If there are any predators here, we shall root them out. No, I think you might wish to concentrate your efforts closer to town, I said, as my sisters raced up the mound behind me. The captain gave a dismissive grunt. My dear lady, who ever heard of a feral wolf living in town? No, if we hope to capture the beast, then this is as good a place to begin. But it's a mistake, I said. I was huffing and puffing from the exertion, and I laid my injured hand upon the central rock. You ought to... Such a powerful blast rocketed up through my fingers that I recoiled with a cry. Emma reached out to me. Mary seized me before I collapsed to the ground. Are you quite all right? Said the captain. My hand throbbed. A spasm of pain shot through the tips of my fingers like electricity, and there was a smell of ozone in the air. As the vibration subsided, I reached out again, much more cautiously this time, and dragged one finger across the lichen-speckled rock. This was no passing creature. Stones do not hold such powerful emotion. I could barely contain myself, and in a harsh whisper I said, Captain, you must smash this down, and do not tarry, for there is something alive entombed within. That's the end of chapter 16. It was a short one. I might read a second one today. I'm not sure yet. But I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you very much. And we'll see you later. Bye.